Well, good morning and welcome to Portfolio Institutional's ESG Club Conference. My name is Mark Dunn and I'm going to be your host today. And when I'm not standing on a stage halfway up the Shard, you usually find me tied to a desk editing Portfolio Institutional. And for those of you who don't know it, it's a magazine for pension schemes, insurers, charities and family offices. We don't look at admin. Instead, we focus on what I personally see as the sexier side of what our readers do, and that's investment. And that is the reason why we're here today. The theme of this conference, and just checking it, is creating sustainable change. And government policy and legislation aside, I think the best way of achieving that is through the decisions that institutional investors make when they're allocating capital. And that's all quite interesting. It's been quite of a journey to have got here. To give some background, I was actually educated at a faith school. And what happened, that meant is that we had every now and again charities and politicians used to come around and visit us and talk to us about topics such as abortion or the importance of supporting people in the emerging markets. Or don't buy these particular oranges because they're from South Africa and we don't agree with a particular policy that the government have implemented. Now that was back in the 1980s and I don't know if any of you in the room can remember, but at the time there was a little bit of a panic when some scientists worked out or claimed that there was a hole in the ozone layer. And what that could mean for us, it could mean that cancer rates would rise and we wouldn't be allowed out in daylight, and people were a little worried. But from what I can remember of those times is the response just seemed to be is don't use aerosols. Which, given the time, the fashions at the time would have been quite difficult, but I think an ozone-friendly version came out. That was like good. But as I say, my recollection is that that's what I can remember the response was. The church, however, were a little bit more proactive on the issues that they believed were needed to be tackled to make the world a better place. They announced that they were no longer going to be investing either directly or indirectly in anything that would benefit South Africa, again, because of the apartheid policy. And now, faith-based charities, of course, they do put restrictions on how they invest their capital. That's not unusual. But the point is, and the reason why you're listening to a stranger talking about his school days, is this is when I was for the first time aware of an institutional investor actually allocating capital specifically to drive an outcome, a successful outcome that they believe will make the world a better place. Okay, and that strategy was one of exclusion, which in itself is quite interesting, but times have changed and we have come a long way since then. That's now more than 30 years later, I'm standing in front of you and investing to make the world a better place, to make the world a more equal place, to make it a more secure place, is now a mainstream strategy. It is very rare to come across an institutional investor that doesn't have an environmental, social or government strategy in some form in their portfolios. And you know, it's not just about climate change in South Africa anymore. There's a lot more to building a better world than that. And it involves things such as providing access to clean drinking water, access to healthcare, finding ways to reuse our waste rather than disposing of it. It's about making sure that little children can be at school or out playing football rather than in a mine, looking for minerals that we can put in our phones and our electric cars. It's about making sure that the wind farms that we need to generate cleaner forms of energy are made from sustainable sources. Okay, so there's a lot more to it than that, and that is why at Portfolio Institutional we focus quite heavily on ESG, because there's a lot of things for investors to consider and there's a lot for them to understand, because this is a constantly evolving market, it's a constantly evolving strategy. And today we have 4 panel discussions for you, which we hope will highlight that ESG is no longer just about phasing out fossil fuels or South Africa, because since my school days, this industry's come an awfully long way. Thank you. And so we move on to our first discussion, which is called Achieving a Just Transition. Of course, this is, of course, moving the economy from extractive to regenerative without destroying communities. And as I've just said, ESG is a very complex issue. And you do have to be very careful that in trying to solve one problem, you don't create another one, because the social issue, of course, is part of ESG. And believe me, there's not much of a payoff if we're living in a world with lower temperatures and free from extreme weather patterns if people are being put into poverty. So we need to work out how we can leave no one behind and take everyone with us. So I need some volunteers to talk about this. I'll tell you what, about you two there and John, yourself? Come on.
Where should I go? I'll be in order.
Thanks for joining me, guys. Thank you very much. Your brief today is to make sure these people don't get distracted by that wonderful view. So it's all down to you. I think it'd be a great place if we just start with the introductions. Bella, could we start with you, please?
Absolutely. Oh, introduction. Sorry, I was distracted by the view. Hi.
That's not a nice dive. No panels looking at you. Go on.
I'm Bella Landymore. I'm the Policy Director at the Impact Investing Institute. We've been set up for 3 years now, part funded by government, part funded by financial sector actors, to grow the market for impact investing. And impact investing is specifically investment made for a positive, measurable impact and a financial return. So we're not talking philanthropy here, we're not talking concessional returns, we're talking about mainstream financial markets and financial returns and impact.
That's great, thank you, Bella, of course, because priority one for a lot of these schemes, of course, is making a return. They've got obligations, so thank you very much. John.
Hello, good morning, everybody. I'm John Mulligan. I'm Director of Market Relations and the Climate Change Lead at the World Gold Council. And I always start by saying, I'm guessing some of you are a little surprised to find the World Gold Council here. I will explain, hopefully, over the course of this conversation why, but I've been at the World Gold Council for 18 years now, and the World Gold Council was formed 34 years ago, initially to focus on stimulating demand for gold. It was formed by the larger gold mining companies at the time. However, increasingly over the last decade or so, it's been more a case of making the value chain fit for purpose. And so when I started, it was all about focusing on the markets and demand. Increasingly now we're talking about the whole value chain and what that means in terms of both climate impacts, sustainability and responsible sourcing. So that's how the World Gold Council's journey has changed. It's also how my journey has changed too.
Thank you, John. And finally.
Hi, I'm Chandra Gopinathan. I'm a Senior Investment Manager from the Railways Pension Scheme in the Sustainable Ownership Team. I'm in charge of the climate work stream within the scheme itself. So in charge of everything that's net zero related, TCFD related, climate change disclosure related, and just transition is definitely a topic that is front and center for ourselves as an institution and for the investment community as a whole. I'm excited to be discussing more on this subject.
Thank you, thank you. Gentlemen, this is our panel. Just to let you know, it's not just about us. If there's any questions you want to put to our panel, hopefully we'll have time at the end. So we'll do an old-fashioned show of hands. We might have a microphone for you. So hopefully we can fit those in before we finish. There is one absentee. Therese at Newton was supposed to be joining the panel today, but she unfortunately can't be with us through illness. But I did speak to Teresa on this topic back in April, and she made a very good point. That there will be winners and losers in the transition to a regenerative economy, but the losers won't necessarily be the polluters and the winners won't necessarily be the solution providers, which I think sums up perfectly about the challenge we're facing here. But John, if we can just start with you. Yes, I think some people probably would be surprised the World Gold Council here on a panel like this. Maybe you could tell us a bit more detail about what role gold plays in the transition to a low carbon economy.
Sure, I mentioned the organisation's journey. It was, frankly, institutional investors of scale, long-hold, long-term investors who first put questions to us, largely pension funds and sovereign wealth funds in particular. So when we came along and started talking about gold as an investment asset, a portfolio diversifier, they said, okay, hold on, before you go into your investment case for gold, we want to talk about ESG credentials, and specifically we want to talk about climate. What can you tell us about gold's relationship with climate? 5 years ago, actually, we could tell very little, and frankly, neither could anybody else in the world. We looked around at what academia knew, we looked around at what had been discovered so far in terms of analysing gold's impacts on climate. Now, I tell you that because over the last 5 years, we've tried to address that gap. We've tried to basically, first of all, understand the carbon footprint of gold, and it's a value chain story. gold as an asset, gold as a bullion or bullion-backed products, ETFs, etc., that institutional investors may hold, are actually almost exceptional as assets in that they are related to very few accumulating emissions. In terms of good old Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, which I hope most of you are familiar with, Scope 3 downstream emissions for gold are minimal. So therefore it could be classed as a low carbon asset. But we're fully aware that actually you're interested in the value chain and the embedded emissions from mining. So what we needed to do is both define the carbon footprint. Once we've done that, and we did it in some detail over a couple of years, we then could start to map out gold's decarbonisation pathway. Basically, if you know where the emissions are coming from, and it's all about mining, and it's all about electricity, and you can see what the opportunity is to transition from the high carbon intense energy sources, you can potentially say, okay, well, what is the opportunity to decarbonise? If you can do that, technically you can decarbonise the value chain and the asset. So it's a major opportunity for gold. But of course you need to make it happen. So increasingly what we've looked at is what has the actions that have been done and what impact have they had in terms of climate target alignment. Basically, if you change, for example, diesel in this particular mine at this particular percentage and move to renewable sources, how does that contribute to decarbonisation? We've analysed that on a grand scale, looking at 153 mines, looking at 31 grids, modelling the grids going forward, to allow us to say what's the opportunity, but also what's the current action. Now, that's important, but to go to the just transition point is if you do this, the gold value chain can have an impact way beyond the mine or the asset. Because in many countries, gold will be the driver of the energy transition. It will be the person bringing clean energy to that country. So if you look at Burkina Faso at the moment, or Ghana, or DRC, or even South Africa, I'll come to South Africa because it's been mentioned, you'll see the transition is actually being driven by the gold industry, both the gold industry decarbonising itself, but also because it is such an important driver of socio-economic development and growth in regional and often remote economies, driving further opportunities, bringing the technology, bringing the infrastructure. So it's a complex story in some ways, but in some ways it's a simple one too. It's basically decarbonise the source and you decarbonise the value chain and you bring decarbonisation to economies that would not otherwise have access to it. So that's the kind of overarching story for gold and climate change.
Okay, thank you. Sticking with you there, John.
Sure.
Of course, clean technology is needed, of course, for all the reasons just outlined there, but what are the social implications of switching to cleaner energy sources and, as I say, decarbonising economies?
So it's not just clean technology because it's cleaner.
Yeah.
It is because the key aspect, as I mentioned, is in about 50 to 60% of all gold production is in developing or frontier economies.
Mm-hmm.
In many of those economies, if you have any economic activity that is driven by power, and that is an awful lot of economic activity in the modern world, it needs to be generated and coupled with emissions.
Okay.
So, if you bring clean energy to communities and locations that don't have it, you then enable, as you mentioned earlier, you enable refrigeration. Refrigeration, key to food provision, key to health care and health provision. That would not be available before without emissions. So decoupling emissions from opportunities, development opportunities, actually has impacts for way beyond the mine, for the social ability, the opportunity for socio-economic development. So a key driver of social well-being can be the decarbonisation if it extends beyond the mine. The other aspect about the social implications is the fact that, as I say, because gold is so significant in often local or remote economies, its impacts are far wider than many other economic activities. So going back to the African story, if you look at gold and the, for instance, inferred and induced employment in the Western world, in Canada or Australia, it's probably 2 or 3 people employed per miner. If you look at that in Africa, it is probably 20. So the opportunity spreads, the development opportunity spread, and again, because of those social impacts, the ability for that mining activity to spread by stimulating and catalysing other activity, the social aspects of the transition become far broader.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you. Chandra, turn to you. Railpen, you're committed to considering the social dimensions in your investments. I mean, what does that mean in practice?
It's a very interesting question. Thanks, Mark. So going back a little bit, if you go back, look at our net zero plan from last year and the roadmap from last year, we strive really hard to balance our fiduciary responsibilities with the credibility and the evidence base of what's out there in terms of making our commitments and in terms of walking the talk behind those commitments as well. Okay. With respect to just transition, there is obviously an indicator already with Climate Action 100. There is a just transition indicator which takes into account the basics of reskilling, job losses, employment, and retraining the workforce and moving them into other sort of departments, and so there's no job losses, etc. We think that's just the beginning. There is obviously a lot more work to be done in terms of knowledge and in terms of our understanding of what the social dimension means for the transition itself. I think there's a lot of research that's going on, but the knowledge base still needs to be gathered and developed. And the way we see this moving, and we hope this moves, is for the just transition indicator, not just being an indicator, but being firmly embedded in every single pillar of net zero engagement. So when you talking to a company about their decarbonization strategy or about their capital allocation, that all of it involves a discussion around the social implications. What does that mean? What does that mean for the workers? What does that mean for the communities? I mean, we've had some discussions with companies broaching the subject where they've talked about the impact on the council tax revenues. They've talked about impact on local jobs, and they've talked about how they can potentially move those workers into a coal mine being phased into solar, for example, being retrained in that particular area. So it's very preliminary, but what we are committed to as an institution is to go in and build the knowledge base and build the evidence base to fully understand what this means, and not just as a single indicator, but just as a holistic, integrated way to look at each of these things when you talk to a company. Saying when you're talking about a decarbonization strategy, you need to be the conversation has to be had then and there. It's not a separate indicator altogether, and it's part of the whole thing. So.
Thank you. John, if we just pop back to you quickly. Mining, of course, is very much on the naughty list, environmentalist at the moment, isn't it? I mean, but they are large employers with the whole community sometimes depending on the local mine for their livelihood. So how are mine owners ensuring that communities do not fall into poverty if they're trying to reduce their carbon?
So I've got to challenge your first point that mining is on the naughty list. I mean, there is no energy transition without mining, let's be absolutely honest. I'm not talking about gold mining now, I'm talking about all mining. So World Bank climate smart mining analysis suggests that to deliver the energy transition, you need 40-50% more mining in some metals, multiples more, to allow you to have the infrastructure and technology. So mining being on the naughty list is, I think, worth challenging. I think the challenge is to ensure that mining behaves in a responsible way so it can deliver the metals. And absolutely, so this was not the topic of this conversation, but we've been actively, very proactively engaged in defining responsible, transparent principles by which mining can operate so that it certainly can address this reputational issue, a legacy issue, being on the naughty list. I think that's worth commenting. Yep. I think your second point was about
how mine owners making sure that the communities don't face poverty.
Okay, sure. So as I mentioned, in the areas where responsible gold mining is practiced, it is often the lead in terms of creating income for the local economy. So mining jobs across the board globally are pay way more than the average income. Okay. Quite significantly, however, is this issue of transition. So basically, what does that mean for the jobs going forward? And quite importantly, when it comes to skill sets, reskilling labour, moving the whole mining industry, gold mining in particular, is at a tipping point. It is basically moving towards automation, digitisation, electrification, along with clean energy. Now that has very major implications for jobs. And in some areas, South Africa is a good one, that has been resisted. Basically, we've got coal-powered energy powering a mine, and traditionally those are hard labour-intensive jobs. However, in being knowledgeably reskilling the workforce and in bringing new technology, you are actually producing forward-thinking jobs. So a colleague of mine and I were at one of the oldest and deepest mines in the world quite recently in South Africa. So I'm glad you brought it up. And we went to see the training centre there. And the training centre there was nothing to do with holding drills. It was all to do with virtual reality, joysticks, automation. At that mine, they were laying 64 kilometres of digital cable to allow the mine to be automated. That means the jobs will change, but the jobs will be far more transferable and far more forward-proof, future-proof than they would have been previously. So that's quite key. If that reskilling wasn't happening, that technology and that education may not happen in those locations. So producing a reskilled workforce is important. In terms of the communities, it's, as I mentioned before, the social license to operate for mining and gold mining in particular, possibly because of many legacy issues, the reputation you mentioned, is so crucial that it actually is seen as the core part of the business. There are a couple of gold mining CEOs who say, we're in the mining business, but really we're in the development business. And that is because they are putting that social aspect number one in terms of the priorities. So I think, that mindfulness of the transition, in terms of transitioning the workforce, the fact that your impacts are so much more significant than just the mine. In many countries in the developing world, as I say, Papua New Guinea, Ghana, there's many. Gold is the driver of the industrialization or the modernization of the economy. So socially, its implications are vast, way beyond the mine, and its contribution to the economy is often vast too. So it has socio-economic development impacts, as well as community impacts in terms of reskilling the workforce and protecting the workforce going forward. So I have one more comment that isn't related to the transition, but it's worth mentioning in terms of something like health. Now, we spent quite a lot of time looking at the SDGs and how SDG indicators are mapped against mining. And I'm mentioning this because of, frankly, Mark's point about the reputation issue of mining. When we went to our members, and our members represent about 50 to 60% of all annual corporate production, and we said, we're interested in the SDGs and if you're measuring some of your impacts. And we were, frankly, very pleasantly surprised how not only aware of the SDGs they were, but how they were measuring their impacts already. And if you look at something like health, the healthcare programs in some mines have actually transformed the regional healthcare program. Ghana's anti-malaria program was modelled from a program that was initially piloted in one of the mines. So a fairly substantial impact, well beyond some of the legacy comments, the legacy reputation issues.
Thank you very much, John. Thank you, John. Bella, how can we mobilise more capital towards facilitating a just transition?